Good afternoon. Due to circumstances of destiny which are beyond my power, I'm not able to speak with you in person today. I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry about missing some probably very good presentations and discussions and a final keynote. As said, it was beyond my power. Maybe this is a reminder of the fragility of our strivings and aspirations. No matter how much effort we put into them, they are fragile. We follow several paths at the same time, and sometimes we have to choose for one at the expense of the other. Thank you very much also for the organizers for their generosity and flexibility to allow for us to have this video recorded speech as a plan B. Such making of circumstances anyway is perhaps what everyday life also is about. It is structured by our strivings, ethical and other, but only partially. It repeatedly meets the very ordinary limitations of our time, our bank accounts, our ability to care and to focus. And also, to revise my own past argument, I'm not sure if everyday is the right word. Because destiny brings us routine and ordinary experiences and times, but also drama and surprises. We learn to accommodate with appalling circumstances and carve a livable, survivable, ordinary life within them. But we may also think that our everyday lives are not normal, so we strive for a normal life, and yet we might never actually reach it. Or, more likely and more interestingly, we may reach it, but it will turn out to be something else than we originally hoped it to be. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about everyday today. The debate in anthropology of Islam, if there is an anthropology of Islam, has become polarized between terms ethics and everyday in a way that I find unhelpful. So I will just make 3 quick clarifications, and then I will come with what I hope is a constructive proposal, which is that we should talk more about God. So the clarifications, 3 of them. First, it is an honor for me to talk about my research and some of my ideas about what we might be doing next in this conference. But first of all, I don't think of myself as an anthropologist of Islam. And second, I really don't know enough about what it's like to be a Muslim in Europe. And the idea of an anthropology of something, such as of Islam, lures us to think that we can just take insights from different parts, different situations, different contexts, and transfer them from one place to another, and that will be a kind of wholesale recognition. This can result in situations where we as researchers then critique other researchers for refusing to take their interlocutors seriously because they, in their fieldwork, learn something that doesn't fit with our theory. And I try to keep it as my own ethical maxim to sacrifice my theory to fieldwork learning if I have to. So I have also therefore learned to understand that approaches that are good for one place may not be good for another. My original critique of the anthropology of Islam as a project came from realizing that approaches that were very productive in the field did not really help me to understand my fieldwork, at least not enough. But I think also vice versa, approaches that might be good to understand life in Egypt may not be helpful to understand, or at least not helpful enough to understand what it's like to live as a Muslim subject to secular power in Europe. I'm also painfully aware of what happens when these kinds of insights get transferred. For example, my argument about perfectionist strivings, which have been read and can be read as a way to claim that Salafis are the bad, impossible Muslims who cannot or shouldn't exist. Now, I don't think so, and I do want to remind that my argument was explicitly not only about Salafis, it's equally about love, migration, revolution, individual autonomy. It could be extended to Buddhist enlightenment, intersectional feminism, scientific objectivity, secular tolerance, Sufi mystical paths. All these strivings, if they are followed as an encompassing project of commitment, moral becoming, social reform. They are impossible to realize in the extent and shape they promote, but they do not fail. Rather, sometimes they fail. Real existing socialism kind of failed, although not in China. But they produce something else, something slightly different. And so impossibility doesn't mean failure. It doesn't mean that there is something wrong with people who try the impossible. Rather, it means that there is a productive contradiction going on. So we could think about ethics in an Aristotelian Foucauldian framework as the attempt to become something, and that attempt in itself is an effective reality. That's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it, which I am friendly with, is a more dialectic one that highlights becoming through contradictions. Contradictions which may bring up something else and something more that was originally at stake. And let me emphasize that both approaches are valid and legitimate to understand some things, and less so other things. And let me also emphasize that in the following I will specifically be talking about Egypt and whether or not this is more or less useful or useless for your work on Muslims in Europe and being a Muslim in Europe. This is a matter that we need to discuss afterwards. Second clarification about the two turns. I'm not quite convinced that ethics and everyday are different turns. I think both terms are part of a same turn in anthropology, which could be called an ethical or a phenomenological turn. And what we have is a debate within that turn where there are different propositions about how to understand ethical becoming and everyday life. Also, I think that the most polarizing positions within this turn are rather few in numbers. And most recent research that I have read and I'm aware of is actually not located at either end and might not fit to that kind of binary spectrum in the first place. Third, I think you already know this, but I do not subscribe to the concepts of everyday Islam or everyday Muslims. I have checked and they are nowhere in my work, and I haven't found them in most of the works that have been referred to as sources of these ideas or concepts. I think what has happened is that these kind of concepts have emerged because there is a desire to classify, a desire to categorize, and because Islam is big and has so many different layers and dimensions, it is luring, seductive to think that we can put people into boxes, and then we imagine that there is something like everyday Muslims, which is a totally nonsensical idea to me, because everyday is not a group of people, it's not a theology or a way of life. Everyday is the unremarkable, day-to-day, not so reflected, making do aspect of anything. Anything can be everyday, and anything can be exceptional, special, extraordinary, from a loaf of bread to a prayer to an encounter with somebody. So, and I think also I have not tried to think, hopefully at least, about religion as something that is distinct from the everyday. Rather, I have argued that religion emerges and faith, practice, these kind of strivings and other strivings, they emerge and take shape in the connection between what I have called ordinary lives and grand schemes. But there was a major shortcoming here, which was that grand schemes is a rather intellectual, systematic, abstract, and it doesn't include superhuman intentional beings, especially it doesn't include God. So here I get to my actual presentation today, try to think together with other anthropologists who very recently have been taking up this issue and make some hopefully constructive proposals about how we could pay more attention to the power of God. And that is the title of today's presentation, The Power of God. And sorry about the frequent cuts in this recording, because my camera stops recording every 12 minutes, so I have to stop the recording every once in a while, so you have jump cuts here and there. So, Islam without the subject of human submission and worship, the one God who revealed himself in the Quran, makes as little sense as Christianity without Jesus, the Son of God. There is no doubt that anthropologists and social scientists, and definitely all of us in this conversation, are entirely aware about the God-centeredness of Islamic faith and practice. However, for a long time there has been a remarkable absence of God when it comes to drawing conclusions, taking our ethnographic works to a higher level of abstraction and entering debates. In work that I have been inspired by, God is all over the place in ethnographies, but often kind of disappears when it gets to drawing conclusions. I have no time today to discuss the epistemological and perhaps also institutional and political reasons for this relative absence. Now I just join a recent wave of quite a few colleagues, some of whom are among you in the room, in trying to include God into our thinking more systematically. I make 4 proposals, and these proposals are not meant to be exclusive. I think many other proposals can be made. More, I think this is a kind of thinking in process about where I see interesting things to follow up. The first proposal is to pay ethnographic, now I'm going to read from my notes to be precise, is to pay ethnographic attention to the way different specific powers of God are present in human interactions through linguistic references and the search for guidance and sustenance. Sustenance? I'm not sure about the emphasis. The second proposal is to consider more systematically the forms of relational or relationship power which God commands over humans. The third proposal is to pay attention to the productive tensions and conflicts that arise from the encounter with a God who is both harshly punishing and merciful, disciplining and sustaining, a life giver and a dead maker. The fourth proposal is to think about secularity or the secular as a reconfiguration of God-human relationships, whereby humans are empowered and triadic relationships, where God acts as a supreme mediator between humans, is weakened, transformed, or partially replaced by separate binary relationships. So my first proposal, to pay attention to the different specific powers of God as they are evoked in linguistic interactions. Now, we could also pay attention to mediation, materiality. Birgit Meyer's work on that in Christian context is a very good example of how that can be done. But I stick right now for linguistic context, just because that is the one I understand better. One of the most difficult things about learning to speak Arabic for me was to understand, and not only understand, but to perform in practice, that so many linguistic interactions involve God as a third party. And that this involvement is not simply a figure of speech, but depending on the speaker's intention, it can be, and often is, an intentional inclusion of his supreme power in the relationships I have with you and somebody else has with anybody else. I had learned from early on, for example, that the answer to how are you is Alhamdulillah, praise to God, and that it can be also an evasive answer where one may not be doing so well, but one still praises God. And it took me a little longer to understand that it is also, of course, the performance of a virtue, where contentedness with the will of God is a value in itself and is rewarded by God on Judgment Day. Therefore, no matter how well or badly one is, praises to God on all cases. Alhamdulillah ala kulli hal. And when I started doing fieldwork in the countryside, I encountered speech situations which even much more systematically and also more poetically and eloquently wove God into all kinds of interactions, and especially older people and especially women older than me often master a very virtuoso conversation where no dialogue ever is simply one between two humans, but God always plays a role in various ways: to protect, to command, to help, to revenge, to do all kinds, to heal, to take away the pain, and again as somebody to be grateful to. I want to read to you a longer interview passage because I think it's good to actually listen to this kind of speech. I don't have any recorded passage from everyday interactions where there is often a kind of quick improvised exchange of phrases, but I have a interview that Mukhtar Shehata and I made with Haga Zakiya, a woman in her 50s from the village where I've done fieldwork for a long time. The topic of the interview was the revolution, for a film that Mukhtar and I were making, and her view about the events. She was very excited about the revolution. She was a strong supporter of the revolution. She leaned and still leans towards Islamist movements, but she has quite a complex vision which partly has to do with her children being on different sides but all supporters of the revolution. And she began her speech with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of the all-merciful God, which is a good, pious way to open any action, speech or transaction. And went on to tell about her excitement about the revolution, but also in relation to specific injustices she faced. One was a property conflict in the village, and the other one were grave injustices which her sons, as migrant workers in Saudi Arabia, had recently faced. And she, in the course of her speech, initially did not speak much about God or religion, but God came up in many capacities in the passage of the long interview. For example, when she was talking about the property conflict, she tells, I cite, "I would give him," the lawyer that is, 100 Egyptian pounds every month and keep the 200 pounds of her widow's rent. Our Lord alone knows that they are gone the next day. I don't know how I live the rest of the month. Our sublime and exalted Lord provides. Rabbina subhanahu wa ta'ala biyurzuq." And when she talked about her hope for security and justice for ordinary people, she in turn addressed God as the initiator of conscience. She said, "I pray, Badai, to our sublime and exalted Lord that he gives everybody their conscience in every position, whether a military or a civilian. There is only our sublime and exalted Lord from whom we ask, because he can change the hearts. The hearts are in the hand of our sublime and exalted Lord, because if people see our Lord, then the entire country will be just." She went on to address the need to educate people. She has a keen sense of not being educated enough herself. And towards the end of the interview, she started talking more about issues of injustice and responsibility and her anger that people who had been wronged during the revolution hadn't been given justice. It is here that she shifts towards the end of the interview to an almost preaching mode of demanding, calling, admonishing. This is a longer passage. Haga Zakiya said, "So if I had the means to go to that square," meaning Tahrir Square, "or if it were close to me, or if somebody could have taken me there, I would have joined them, because I believe that our sublime and exalted Lord does not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves." This is a citation from the Quran. "Inna Allah la yughayyiru biqawmin hatta yughayyiru ma bi anfusihim." So what happens is that we escape from God's predestined decree to God's predestined degree. If I'm inside the house, it will also hit me. But I do something I can meet God with, that I can say to him, "I did, O Lord. All I did was praying to him. I was standing in front of them, meaning that she was watching television and sitting in front of the demonstrators she saw on television, changing and switching channels on television. But I feel that they don't say the truth. They say 1/8 of the truth. I don't feel... there is a channel that makes me feel frustrated, another channel, the opposite. I don't know which one to believe. Here Mukhtar intervened and asked, "Last word, Hagga. How do you see tomorrow?" Hagga Zakia: "Tomorrow will be good, God willing, inshallah. With the commandment of God, bi-amrillah, because He commands, our sublime and exalted Lord, the hearts of the people are pure. You say, O Lord, it will not make you shy. Our sublime and exalted Lord will not let anyone go to waste. I'm 53 years old. I have lived my life and lack nothing. If I get 1,000 pounds, I will live on them. If I get 300, I will also live on them. Either way, I won't die for them. But I feel defeated because those people who made sacrifices in the revolution still don't stand on their feet. I'm not defeated because of myself, but because of everybody. I say to our Lord, O Lord, let everyone find their conscience and know," and here her pitch gets louder and she raises her hand for emphasis, "Let everyone find their conscience and know that they stand in front of a generous Lord, and they will be alone in the grave, and they will be questioned. There will be a day when they stand alone in isolation and darkness. Nobody will stand by them, and no money and nothing else will work. And nobody will get more than is written to them." Maktub. So the political theme of the interview highlighted issues of justice, conscience, the ultimate responsibility one has for their acts, and the inevitability of divine destiny. Even with this focus, it is remarkable in how many different aspects God becomes part of the conversation. He is the provider, Ar-Raziq, the one who listens to prayers, the one who can instill hearts with the will for the right and the good. He is the judge after death, and he is the one who writes destinies, and he is the ultimate witness of justice and injustice among humans. Because of the political focus of the interview, other aspects that might have come up didn't, such as worship, proper form of ritual action, health and sickness. Hagga Zakia would certainly affirm them if asked. Remarkably, she did not speak about religion or deen or Islam even once. Also, I think, remarkably, she was not interested in an ethical inquiry about the correct shape of the worship of God. Also, not about establishing a specific coherent understanding. Rather, the moral problem she addressed was blatant injustice and how to end it. In that sense, Hagga Zakia reminds us that although establishing coherence can be and often is the aim of our moral or ethical actions or speeches or reflections, not always, and it not only. And often speaking with God is not about establishing coherence, but about getting to the point, and firmly so. And Hagga Zakia does, and she gets at her most firm when she shifts to a sort of preaching tone that reminds us about the judgment that awaits after death. So I think Hagga Zakia helps us to think about God's power as a moral authority in a way that includes the disciplinary mode of moral or ethical inquiry that has been studied as pious ethics, but also includes other modes such as sustenance, livelihood, destiny, the sense of emphasizing one's point by allying with God, and a few others. And it is important to point out that for Hagga Zakia, these capacities go hand in hand. Some other people I know have highlighted one capacity more than the other, but in any case, conversations such as this, that I have had many more in a not recorded, not as interviews, remind me that the power of God is an intimate part of human interactions, at least in a place like Egypt, and that it can be of different kinds, have different effect, different modalities in different situations, and it might require different cultivated skills and attitudes by humans. This far about the first proposal. The second proposal really follows up on the first proposal to think about the kind of relational power, the relationship power as it might be called, that may be involved. Here I find the work of Bruno Latour quite interesting, because Bruno Latour, at least in the early formulations of his actor network theory, explicitly also suggested that his approach allows us to bring God back into the analysis and take him instead of the position of what he called the crossed-out God of the moderns, which I think could be described as one liberal way to deal with God by limiting his power. And Latour's ideas have been quite influential, in fact, I think. And Latour proposes, or says in We Have Never Been Modern, I quote, "Do we need to add that the crossed-out God in this new constitution turns out to be liberated from the unworthy position to which he had been relegated? The question of God is reopened, and the non-moderns no longer have to try to generalize the improbable metaphysics of the moderns that force them to believe in belief." I think this is a very helpful step forwards, but I think an important tension remains. Latour proposes a parliament of things, and he proposes a flat ontology. And I think this works very well with spirits and saints and science and technology and non-human living beings. But monotheism and Latour's animist approach don't harmonize quite as well. So Latour proposes a parliament of things, but God in the Bible and in the Quran is an absolutist autocrat. He does not share power with republican institutions. If Latour's ontology is flat, monotheism is hierarchical. Monotheism is very much about creating hierarchical relationships that are morally valuable and emotionally very intensive. James Laidlaw has critiqued Latour for attributing agency to things and beings that lack our actorship, more precisely, that in Laidlaw's view lack something that actually is essential for what is an actor, which is moral responsibility. But I think we often do attribute moral responsibility to non-human beings. Animism is very much about that, although we do recognize the jinn are often unpredictable and may not follow our principles. Still, some people can become friends with the jinn. Also, nationalism is very much about attributing that kind of features to collective entities. It is very much the way leftists speak about capitalism, and I think social scientists often treat concepts and abstractions as more or less intentional beings. Neoliberalism, the state, the secular often appear as remarkably conscious entities that aim, attempt and strive and may be held accountable. So, and of course all of this is only a shadow of the crucial intentionality and responsibility of divine beings. The monotheist God in the Bible and in the Quran in particular brings strong moral and emotional relations with humans. These relations are often hierarchical. And it is relational power, but maybe a little different from Foucault's biopower. It's more akin to the contemporary English use of relationships. For example, the kind of relationship that Robert Orsi has described in American Catholicism between heaven and earth. And it is a kind of power that is effective by means of intimate emotional bonds of friendship, love, fear, trust, help, but also enmity, anger, guidance, and importantly, gratefulness. A power to which one can be grateful. I think this is a crucial part of the human-God relationship known as Islam, and I think this was also a key point about learning to speak Arabic with God as a third party in conversations that I went through. Now we get to my third proposal. The third proposal is to think about the tensions, the productive tensions that emerge from the coexistence of different forms of power, even different ontologies that are inherent to human faith in God in any tradition. In Islamic traditions, this is well exemplified by the so-called 99 beautiful names of God, which are divine attributes that can be found in the Quran. And this was an issue in an interesting conversation I had with a man I call B, just his initial. He is a poet, quite interesting, unusual character. He is quite pious, but also very irreverent and outspoken leftist, but also prays regularly enough to have a dark spot on his forehead as a mark of his piety. In Ramadan 2 years ago, he posted on his Facebook account a verse from the Quran. It goes, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, اعلموا أن الله شديد العقاب وأن الله غفور رحيم. Know that God is severe in punishment and that God is forgiving and merciful. Lots of people commented on that verse and said that it had also made them stop and think, and I also stopped and thought, and I wrote to him and asked, what do you mean? What do you think about this? And he answered, I cite, "This verse," says B, "is for me the confirmation that the aspect of forgiving with its reality and necessity does not deny the existence of the aspect of punishment. And that's natural, because the divine subject, al-Dhat al-Ilahiyya, in Islamic religion is the subject that carries all human attributes, sifat, in full divine extent or capacity, qadr, and which God put into the human with the human's limited extent or capacity, because He, God, breathed into him, the human, His divine spirit." And the verse is a confirmation that the difference of the qualities themselves is apparent in the beautiful names of God, where it says that God is the first, al-awwal, and at the same time the last, al-akhir. And He is the visible, al-zahir, and the invisible, al-batin. That also confirms and explains the difference of the qualities humans have. Note, this is a personal interpretation that may be right or wrong. In a private message, I then wrote to B again and asked for his permission to quote this interpretation for the verse in a research article. He replied and he clarified, "Of course, I have no problem, but our Lord does not have schizophrenia. Only we do." And so in his replies, B quite intentionally addressed what he sees, and I agree with him, as a fundamental tension between God's capacity to unite all human qualities as well as superhuman qualities, and the human incapacity to find a balance between them. For B, God is a kind of singularity. He is not subject to human knowledge. We can always only know parts, sides, specific expressions of His will. And so all of this makes sense for God, but humans try to be one or the other, try to take one or the other seriously. And the unity of life and death, reward and punishment, visible and invisible, can result in us, in humans, in a schizophrenic experience of incommensurability. I don't mean to use schizophrenic here in a literal sense. It's a metaphoric use. In psychology, schizophrenia is a pathological condition. I don't think this condition that B describes is pathological. I think it's a common feature of human understanding, whereby our ability to understand things is limited to aspects. And I think it's actually a good concept in that sense that we are unable to see the whole, and therefore we compartmentalize, we select, we can think about one thing at a time and another thing at another time. And I think also it is interesting because it helps us to think about the power of God over humans and with humans, not as a one-dimensional force that moves us into one single direction. Anybody who is a little bit aware of the rich history of Muslim lands know that Islamic traditions have not simply pushed people into just one path and one way, but into a lively conversation that can go in different directions. And so perhaps we could think about this kind of tension as a productive dialectic or a productive tension or contradiction that compels humans to take a stance in one way or another towards the forgiving and the punishing, the visible and the invisible, the disciplining and the sustaining, the closed and the open-ended dimensions of God's relation with his creatures. But keep in mind what B said, God doesn't have schizophrenia. We do. These different dimensions, different potentials or capacities, qadr, the Arabic word is quite good in putting it, in pinpointing it, they can be constitutive of different kinds of communities, different ways in which humans relate to each other and to God. And here we get to the point of secularism, my fourth proposal, to think about secularity, the secularism, not so much as an entity in its own right, but as a range of different configurations of the relationship between humans and God. Bear is an explicit political secularist, and yet it is interesting also to hear a different voice of somebody who stood for a moment on the same side of the revolution but has a different idea about secularism. Ha, a poet from Alexandria, a school teacher whom I met several times between 2011 and 2014 in my fieldwork on literary writing in Alexandria, used to be a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, left them because he had too much a mind of his own, but with the revolution he became again more aligned with their political project. And when Muhammad Mursi was deposed with a military coup and a counter-revolution, he joined the Muslim Brotherhood's followers in demonstrations to get Mursi back to power. It was at this time that I met him in a cafe in Alexandria, January 2014, I think. He was enthusiastic and confident that his struggle would result in victory soon. And he was also confident and enthusiastic about the role that he saw Islam as having as a liberatory or emancipatory ground for struggle. So I cite from my field notes. In Egypt, Ha explained to me, emancipatory ideas have been united with Islamic faith, which gives them an enormous force of determination, because as a Muslim he knows that his existence is eternal. It proceeds in three stages: this world, dunya, in-between state after death and resurrection, barzakh, and the afterworld, akhirah. This ground of faith, Ha argued, gave the protesters the willingness to die as martyrs, which meant that they and 70 persons of their family will go directly to paradise. If I get caught by a bullet, it is just one hit and I pass to the next world, Ha told me, and went on to argue that leftists and liberals have a weaker ground of faith, which is why they cling harder to this worldly life and come up with ideological differences with the Muslim Brotherhood as a pretext for their lack of courage. I think Ha's vision of the cowardice of the liberals and leftists for having a weaker ground of faith is unfair. It is definitely unfair towards somebody like B, who actually was also participating in some quite courageous events throughout the revolution. However, I think he has an important point, which is that he brings secularism into connection with questions about God, humans' relations with God, and also life after death and faith. And this is also something that is done by Saba Mahmood on a different note in her, unfortunately, sadly, last book, where she, in the last chapter, makes a very interesting argument about the foundations of what she calls secularity, which she identifies in the debate that evolved around Yusuf Zidan's best-selling novel Azazil, which is about early Christianity, and the Coptic Orthodox Church protested to it strongly because they saw the novel as an affront against basic Christian tenets. Mahmood argues that in this debate about the novel there are, I cite, two incommensurable understandings of religion. One in which humanity itself provides the values and models of human flourishing against which the contributions of religion's tradition are to be measured and judged, and another wherein human existence must be molded in accord with the dictates of a transcendent God. End of quote. I think this is very helpful to get a discussion about secularity away from somewhat mystifying talk about the secular as an entity in its own right, and think about the secular more as a relationship or a reconfiguration of a human-God relationship. I would like to add to that I think there are more than two. I think many more than two, and I think only some of them are incommensurable, and sometimes their incommensurability is not such a big issue. They can exist sometimes quite easily together in one family, even in one person. However, the point is important, so I try to develop it to say that one way to think about secularism is a transformation of a triadic relationship of God. I borrowed this from Emanuel Schäublin's work on zakah, almsgiving in Nablus, Palestine, where he argues that the ethical relation of almsgiving is a triadic relation, which is never just between humans, but also humans and God, and that many ethical relations fundamentally have this triadic shape, which means also that they extend beyond this world and extend beyond the visible world, and often their very aim and their very object is in life after death, in Judgment Day, and not in what we are, the here and now. So I think that many forms of political, social hierarchies, relations, values are based, at least in Egypt, on such triadic God-human relationships. And what secularisms, in the plural, do is that they reconfigure these relations. One possibility is what Mahmoud describes as humans dethroning, disempowering God and becoming themselves the creators where secular humanity rules. This would be basically an atheist stance, and it exists, although it's rare in Egypt. Another version would be that of B, where humans and God enter more individualized relationships, and where the relationships amongst humans may be less dominated by a triadic relationships with God, but where nevertheless God remains in command, the creator God to whom humans submit. As well as, for example, the form of secularity that the Egyptian state presents, where many triadic community and many triadic relationships that constitute polity and community remain in power, but the state plays into them, uses them, and tries to manipulate them to its ends, and where the nation state becomes, and especially the security state, becomes the central instance of power over life and death of humans. There will be a few more. We don't have time to get through all of them, but I think secularism, to think with B further, shares the same kind of schizophrenic relationship as, according to B, does human faith in God. We cannot, or we find it difficult to get the big picture, and we follow one side or the other, and at best we might be aware that there is a bigger picture that we can only comprehend with difficulty. So on a final note, let me emphasize that just that also such schizophrenic inability to see all of the coming together of different sides, which is not a fault, which is a feature of human understanding, is also part of our research. So I emphasize that this is a proposal to add to the debate, not to replace any other proposals. Thank you.